The story of Dire Straits began in London after brothers Mark and David Knopfler moved down from Leeds to pursue a music career. Prior to this, the brothers had both played in various bands, whilst Mark had a short career in journalism and lecturing at universities.
Mark Knopfler had actually, he'd gone to university and he'd got a degree and he'd had a job as a journalist at the Yorkshire Evening Post. He married his childhood sweetheart as well and got divorced quite young. So by the time that Dire Straits had started, he was an adult.
Because Mark Knopfler is so well schooled in the English language, his lyrics have a sense of place, and that place is invariably Britain, be it at the Wild West End of London or the waterfront of Newcastle. But he was also influenced heavily by an American blues strand, particularly people such as Lonnie Johnson, who had that kind of rumbling reflection that some American blues does have. And that was his vision, to merge the sense of English place with a vague American blues sound. And you had something which actually hadn't happened before.
The kind of blues artists that I associate more with Dire Straits are actually the British blues musicians of the 60s, and people like Clapton and John Mayall.
I would say the big influence would have been J.J. Cale, the American singer, because he brought in this very laid-back, very everything's very restrained, almost a whisper. My feeling is that would be the big influence on Mark Knopfler's singing style.
Once in London, the brothers met bassist John Illsley and drummer Pick Withers. Under the new name of Dire Straits, which reflected their mutual financial situation at the time, they recorded a 5-track demo which included future hits Sultans of Swing.
Sound of the river, you stop and you hold everything.
Well, Sultans of Swing itself is a very interesting song. Mark Knopfler saw this band, allegedly called the Sultans of Swing, playing in a pub in Ipswich, and he wrote a song about the whole miserable experience. Now, whether this is true or not remains to be seen, because it feels autobiographical, which again might just be a tribute to his craft. Obviously, Sultans of Swing makes SOS, so maybe it was an appeal for help.
Competition in other places.
They went to Charlie Gillett, the BBC London radio DJ. I think they just wanted to, as you do when you're in a band, just wanted to give him a tape and go, oh, if you've got any feedback or whatever, then let us know.
London town.
But he played it on the radio because he liked it that much and put a shout out to record companies to sign this band. And lo and behold, 2 months later, they were signed to Phonogram Records.
This is 1977, it's the year of punk. And I think a lot of more conservative, a lot of more traditional broadcasters were concerned about punk, were concerned about that they didn't understand it, that it did not speak to them, that they were being pushed aside. And I think that the sound of those early Dire Straits songs, taps into something more conventional, something that they can understand, something that they can get behind, that is, in their comfort zone, which I kind of think is part of the reason why so quickly they get picked up.
He can play the honky-tonk like anything.
After being signed to a UK label, the band were heard by Warner's, who would soon distribute their album in the US. The self-titled debut found success in America after Sultans of Swing reached number 4 on the Billboard charts.
I think it worked in the US particularly because they had quite a US-friendly sound. At the time, obviously, there was punk going on in Britain. Maybe people kind of were like, what is this bluesy kind of sound? What is this rootsy sound? And maybe didn't get it. Eventually, it became successful. They kind of enticed people into their world. But, I mean, for the US, it just went straight away. It was made for the US, really, those hits.
They were doing stripped-back music, but it wasn't punk, even though they came at the time of punk. So actually, they found this niche, which was, this kind of rarely explored area of doing, actually quite, everything's quite simple, but just very, very well played, very virtuosic, without ever going off into kind of endless guitar solos.
The band swiftly produced a follow-up album, Communique, which would also chart worldwide. Then, at one of their gigs in Los Angeles, they were noticed by legendary singer-songwriter Bob Dylan. Impressed by their performance, Dylan asked Mark Knopfler to work with him on his next album.
Dylan went to see Dire Straits play in Los Angeles and very much enjoyed them and struck up a friendship. Now, the background to this, in Dylan's terms, is that this was the moment where he became a fire and brimstone Christian, and he was making extremely hardcore Christian records. Now, Knopfler had never been a Christian himself, but his guitar playing could add a sense of warmth to Dylan's lyrical harshness. It was almost like sprinkling a little sugar to help sweeten the pill of this fundamental Christianity that Dylan was embracing at the time.
Mark would go on to produce one of Dylan's albums, so it was an interesting relationship, especially seeing as Mark's lyrics were often compared to Dylan. I think they obviously kind of like fed off each other creatively.
Because Knopfler was very technical, then they could produce albums together, such as Dylan's Infidels, which is where the relationship stagnated, shall we say, because Knopfler disowned the final result, which Dylan had got his hands on and changed a little bit. However, time, as we all know, is a great healer, and by 2011 and 2012, they were touring together again. So it's a long-standing relationship, and I do think that Dylan sees something of himself in Mark Knopfler.
During the recording of Dire Straits' third album, Making Movies, David Knopfler suddenly left the band, bringing a permanent end to the brothers' partnership within the group.
Success doesn't keep people together. What keeps people together, actually, in the early days is failure, us against the world, and, you know, knowing you're good. So obviously they knew they were good because they clearly played all the time and practiced all the time in the early days when they're playing all the pubs in South and North London. And, you know, you had these two brothers who probably were sort of bound together by their attempt to make it and the world's indifference. Then they become very, very quickly one of the biggest bands in the world, synonymous with mainstream blues rock. And Mark Knopfler just comes to the fore.
David, at that point, was just kind of getting the impression, probably the correct impression, that it was the Mark Knopfler show, and was feeling a bit of a sideman and wanting to do his own thing and have input into the records he was making. I mean, the official reason is musical differences, but then the official reason is always musical differences. Either
you're kind of in for this and you're prepared to work for this, or you're not. And I think that David Knopfler, it's not a nice thing to say, but I don't think he could quite handle the pace. Maybe he wasn't quite as ambitious as Mark.
Then once David Knopfler had left Dire Straits, then Mark Knopfler's ambition and vision came to the fore. He was much more unfettered. He was someone who would now chop and change his collaborators at will, apart from the bassist John Isley, who was there for the duration. And it was his band now.
As the 80s began, the band made use of the rise of music television to promote Making Movies and their subsequent output.
A love-struck Romeo, sing the streets a serenade.
One of the problems with Dire Straits breaking America was that MTV was taking off at the same time. Now, with the best will in the world, there are more handsome pop stars than Mark Knopfler. Romeo and Juliet, we had a very, very handsome man miming some of these quite intensely emotional lyrics. Now, not for a moment did anyone pretend that this very, very handsome man was Mark Knopfler. But it didn't make it explicit that this very, very handsome man wasn't Mark Knopfler. That's all I'm saying.
What you gonna do about it? Juliet, the dice was loaded from the start.
The band embracing MTV so early on was a genius move, really. It showed kind of how smart they were and how on the ball they were. MTV came out in '81. Nobody really knew what was going to happen with it. They didn't know it was going to explode and end up kind of forming youth culture in the 80s and 90s, which it did. They took a risk, really, by kind of going with it. But I think they saw something in MTV They saw an opportunity, and I think it shows how smart they were. They got on board with it, they started making these really interesting videos, and as a result, sold loads of records. It was really smart.
At this point, Mark also began to work on even further projects outside of the band, including composing film soundtracks.
Because he's a qualified journalist, that means he can write to deadlines. And that means that he can write to order, if required. Writing soundtracks is about writing to deadlines and writing to order. Therefore, he turned out to be very, very good at it. His soundtracking is wildly different. The Last Exit to Brooklyn is as harrowing as the novel and the film. His soundtrack to The Princess Bride is beautiful, it's gorgeous. Local Hero. Local Hero, it's the best thing about that film, and it's a pretty good film.
Local Hero is a great soundtrack. It was very suited to the movie as well, which was all about being low-key. And it was one of those great British movies. It seemed like it was going to go under the radar, and then it became a hit, and it was a very sweet movie.
There is something of the Dire Straits or the Mark Knopfler song in Local Hero, you know. It's the old guy on the beach. It's the Fulton Mackay character on the beach. You just won't sell the land, you know. There's a very, very strong dovetailing of sentiment, context, and music.
If Dire Straits had never existed, I think Mark Knopfler would be one of our great soundtrackers.
Well, the men come in these places.
Mark also became a writer for other singers when a song he decided not to include on their fourth album, Love Over Gold, gave Tina Turner a hit with Private Dancer.
I'm your private dancer, a dancer for money. Do what you want me to do.
Now, I love Tina Turner and I love Private Dancer, but I don't think that Mark Knopfler penned hit would have worked as a track for him. No, not at all. I think Mark was right to give it away. It has been written from a female perspective. It's about a lap dancer. Just sound creepy if a guy sang it.
Striving for better sound quality, Mark wanted to try new digital technology for the next Dire Straits album. Brothers in Arms became one of the first albums to be recorded on digital tape and directed at the emerging CD market.
It was one of the first albums to come out on CD, and the really smooth digital production of it was just tailor-made for the times. There's a lot of like high-tech digital sound systems being produced at that time that people were starting to buy, and taking stereo very seriously in that respect. And it worked well on the radio. And you know, I mean, there are good songs on it, there's no question of that, but it just worked very well with the kind of ethos of the time. It sounded good coming out of expensive car stereos.
At this point, mainstream rock band, the band had properly arrived. Everybody loved them. They were kind of soundtracking everyone's lives. It was one of those records that everybody had, and they deserve it. It's a great record, great radio records, really hooky, amazing kind of guitar riffs.
The second single from the album, Money for Nothing, would become one of their most successful singles. The video also became an MTV staple.
I think it is a video classic, and again, it's of its time. I mean, I seem to remember you've got like this kind of neon thing going on, and you know, you've got that sort of guitar riff that comes in, which is kind of naff at the same time as quite irresistible.
Look at them yo-yos, that's the way you do it. You play the guitar on the MTV.
They knew that by getting their video played and by referencing MTV in the song, which was a smart move, it would sell loads of records, and it did. I think that video is great. It's quite weird. The song references a microwave oven, again, quite odd, but it kind of works. It's brilliant. I think pop's at its greatest when it's a bit weird.
We got to install microwave ovens, custom kitchen delivery.
And it was a clever song, really, because on one level it was, you know, it was just saying, this is ridiculous, you know, it is money for nothing. And then on the other, it's a big celebration of it. So it was very 1980s.
Brothers in Arms went on to become one of the biggest selling albums of all time. Today, it has sold over 30 million copies. The success, however, led to the first breakup of the band.
Sometimes you just hit gold, and there's nothing that you can do to stop it. No matter how you try for it, it might not happen. Here, they did. And you can say there isn't a wasted note on it. There's joy in Walk of Life. There's despair in your latest trick. There's Knopfler's fantastic, very visual lyrics. And it sounds brilliant. It doesn't sound like anyone else, actually.
The subject matter resonated incredibly well with, you know, the blue-collar American audience. Everything from the title song, you know, these mist-covered mountains, to the kind of the air-punching, money-for-nothing thing. It spoke to the average American.
The thing with Brothers in Arms is like a lot of records like that, it's sort of started to become about numbers. And it was like, it sold this many copies and they've sold out this many tickets and they're on to it. And it just becomes statistics, and the actual music itself just kind of gets forgotten. It just becomes a commodity. And I think they felt a little bit just exhausted by that. The fact that it went on for so long and they were forced to tour it for so long. And that was the reason why they kind of called it quits at that point.
I think there was an interview with Mark where he said he didn't want to be the biggest, he just wanted to be kind of the best musically, and I think that was a problem for him. He suddenly had all the success and he didn't really know what to do with it.
Mark had called quits on the band to focus on solo projects and film soundtracks, but 3 years later announced that Dire Straits would reform for another album. However, On Every Street was released to mixed reviews.
Calling Elvis, is anybody home?
People have been waiting a long time for Dire Straits to follow up the most successful album of its period. And as a result, On Every Street was never, ever constructed to be that successful. And it was also not quite as good, but it was mercilessly panned.
They came along at the right time, and then you get on a wave, and it's like you can do no wrong. And then that, of course, that wave crashes, and you sort of pick up where you left off at some point.
Is anybody home? Calling Elvis.
The period that Dire Straits fitted into, whether it was, you know, by volition or, you know, by happy accident or whatever, that was over.
On Every Street came out in 1991. They were so out of vogue by that time. The 80s sound that they'd kind of popularised, the kind of adult-orientated rock, or AOR as it became known, was not very favourably looked upon by that stage. And people were looking for something a little bit heavier and a bit rawer. And so, yeah, it wasn't a very well-received album.
A long distance, baby, so far from home. Don't you think maybe you could put him on?
If it hadn't followed up the album that it was following up, it would have been lauded not necessarily as a classic, but as a really good album of its time. Mark Knopfler was never one to be rushed after the first initial rush of Dire Straits' creativity. He took his time. He was waiting for the storm of superstardom to abate before reconvening Dire Straits. And he made an album just as good as their other albums.
Dire Straits finally dissolved in 1995 after Mark decided he wanted to focus on his solo career with no plans to reform the band.
These mist-covered mountains.
I don't think Mark Knopfler needs to reform Dire Straits. I mean, every time he tours, he'll just sort of 80 nights at the Royal Albert Hall. You know, the man who clearly has no visible reason to reform Dire Straits. And I know they've got their thing, the Straits or whatever it is, which is some iteration of a Dire Straits, of several Dire Straits touring bands over the years. But I think, you know, it is Mark Knopfler's band, and at this point, he doesn't need to. I don't think he wants to. You know, he seems to enjoy doing his more kind of folky projects. The kind of the sound of the last couple of albums has been more intimate in scale. And I think that's where he feels his creative juices are at.
They did 6 albums. They've got a brilliant catalogue. All those albums are terrific. it feels finite. And Mark Knopfler has been making albums ever since, so it's not as if the voice has been silenced.